Virginia, 1875. In the valley of Black Hollow, silence lingered heavier than the morning fog after the epidemic had passed. The churchyard brimmed with fresh graves, wooden markers standing like teeth against the horizon, each one a reminder of how quickly life had drained from the town. Farms lay abandoned, chimneys cold, and the roads once busy with wagons echoed only with the sound of crows. From this devastation, only 2 children emerged untouched, twins named Elias and Abigail Harrington. They were 10 years old, pale, graceful, and outwardly perfect. They sat in the church pews with polished shoes and folded hands, their river-colored eyes unblinking, their faces serene. To a grieving community, they seemed like proof of providence, a blessing carved out of ruin. Yet wherever they stood, adults faltered. Men gripped their chests, women collapsed without warning, strong voices broke into silence. A blacksmith died on his stool as his hammer fell from his hand. A teacher slipped to the floor mid-lesson, and each time the twins were present, watching with expressions too calm for children. Pastor Isaac Morrell, who had kept a meticulous parish journal since the war, began to notice marks in his book not written by his own hand. Names of the living appeared in small, neat script, each paired with dates not yet arrived. When the bells tolled, the entries proved exact. By autumn, whispers grew into fear. The twins knew more than they should, and each death seemed counted in advance. In Black Hollow, survival no longer belonged to chance or to God's will, but to the quiet ledger of 2 children who smiled while the town withered. Before we open the hidden pages of Pastor Morrell's journal and follow the footsteps of the Harrington twins through Black Hollow, take a moment to join our community. If this unsettling beginning already chills you, subscribe now and ring the bell so you never miss the buried horrors we uncover. Leave a comment telling us what city or state you watch from, because these stories often took place in towns not unlike your own. Share this tale with someone who believes history holds no more secrets. The truth is darker than they imagine, and the journey into Black Hollow has only begun. Black Hollow was a small settlement tucked into the folds of the Virginia hills. The kind of place that might have remained a footnote on a county map had tragedy not carved its name into memory. Before the epidemic, it was modest but alive. A church with a whitewashed steeple, a schoolhouse whose single bell marked the days, a tavern where laughter and arguments filled the evenings, and farms scattered along the valley floor. Families survived through hard work, trading corn, tobacco, and labor in the rhythm of the seasons. The war had already scarred them, taking fathers and sons, leaving widows to manage fields and children to grow faster than they should. When the fever swept through in 1874, it left devastation far deeper than the conflict had. By the summer of 1875, the town was a shell, its people hollowed by grief and silence. The churchyard stood crowded with markers carved in haste. Some graves bore only initials, others none at all. The tavern, once noisy, served mostly as a meeting hall for hushed conversations. The mill wheel turned sluggishly, its workers too few to run it full. Many homes stood abandoned, shutters banging loose in the wind, doors swinging on broken hinges, fields choked with weeds. Even the air carried the weight of absence, a stillness that pressed on those who remained. In this desolation, Elias and Abigail appeared almost like apparitions. Their house, the old Harrington place, kept an unusual order. Curtains hung clean, paths swept, their clothes pressed with a care absent elsewhere. They walked together through the streets, quiet but always visible, their steps matched in rhythm, their eyes level and watchful. To the grieving, they seemed an impossible reminder of purity untouched by death. To others, their perfection unsettled rather than comforted. The first who noticed unease was Martha Hensley, a widow who tended her small garden with trembling hands. She saw the children pause at her gate, heads tilted in unison, before moving on without a word. Later that night, her only cow was found dead in the stall, though it had shown no sign of illness. Others began to connect their presence with sudden misfortune. The blacksmith who allowed Elias to step inside his forge collapsed before the fire, never rising again. Miss Alcott, the schoolteacher, gently braided Abigail's hair one Sunday after service. 2 days later, she died suddenly at her desk, chalk still clutched in her fingers. Neighbors whispered, but none spoke openly, for the children smiled with a courtesy that made denial easier than accusation. Pastor Morell tried to maintain a sense of order. He preached of endurance, of faith after loss, urging his dwindling flock to see the twins as symbols of hope. Yet each night, when he opened his parish journal, new words waited for him. Names appeared in a small, even hand, written before death touched the person. Alongside each name stood a date, precise and merciless. When the bell tolled, it was always on schedule. He burned one page only to find the same entry written again the next morning. The journal, once his testimony to God's work, had become a ledger of the grave. The survivors of Black Hollow moved with caution. Doors closed when the twins walked by. Eyes dropped to the ground, avoiding their pale gaze. Yet they always lingered at the edges of gatherings, still and observant, as though they were not part of the town but its silent auditors. Livestock grew restless in their presence. Dogs howled when they approached, and birds abandoned the trees that bordered their path. Even the air thickened when they entered a room, and silence followed them like a shadow. By late summer, the town seemed less like a community and more like a waiting room for death. Families measured their days not by the turning of the mill or the ringing of the school bell, but by whether the twins appeared near their homes. Their presence became a prophecy, their footsteps an omen. The Harrington children, unscathed and unchanging, walked among the ruins with the serenity of figures who knew more than the living should. And in the silence of Black Hollow, every survivor began to understand that the epidemic had not ended at all. It had simply taken on another form, one that wore the faces of children. Black Hollow's survivors moved in narrowing circles around a handful of figures who tried, each in a failing way, to hold the valley together. At the center stood Pastor Isaac Morell, a gaunt man thinned by funerals and sleeplessness, who kept the parish journal with a precision that had once comforted the town. The book, bound in scuffed leather and darkened by lantern soot, recorded births, baptisms, marriages, and the slow pageant of harvests. After the epidemic, it became a register of endings. By midsummer, new entries began appearing between his lines in a steady, even hand not his own, as if the paper remembered events before they occurred. Names aligned with dates not yet reached, and tidy marginal marks repeated in pairs suggested a private arithmetic that did not belong to Scripture. Morell locked the journal, carried it on his person, hid it beneath his pillow, and still found fresh ink waiting at dusk. Flanking him was Dr. Jonathan Keene, a young physician whose belief in modern methods had survived war hospitals but faltered in Black Hollow. He dissected the town's grief into symptoms, noted pulses, examined lungs, and kept orderly casebooks that refused to yield a cause. Hearts stilled without rupture, brains quieted without swelling, and the bodies of otherwise strong adults took on the slack absence of sudden sleep. He chased ordinary culprits, bad well water, tainted provisions, miasma blown up from the river, and found nothing consistent except proximity to the Harrington twins. Around these two, a small caste carried the residue of ordinary life, repurposed by fear. Widow Martha Hensley kept to her garden, but marked the weather by the children's footsteps, rather than the sky. Her cow would not feed when the twins had passed the gate, and her cat vanished for days afterward, returning with a coat raised as if by winter static. Silas Burrow worked the forge alone now, apprentice turned master by loss, and hammered iron in a shop that no longer rang like a livelihood, but like a bell for the inevitable. He spoke less, watched more, and locked his door while the bloom still glowed on the anvil. The tavern keeper swept a room that had shed its songs and became a counting house for anxieties, where men compared patterns in hushed tones, how often the children paused at a threshold, how long they lingered by a fence, how many breaths seemed to narrow in a room when they entered. The schoolhouse stood shuttered, its single bell brown with rust, desks dusted to a thin gray, and slates turned to mirrors for the light that no longer fell on lessons. The absence of children amplified the sound of the twins' hymn voices on Sundays, precise and perfectly paired, a music that felt memorized from a source older than the congregation. The Harrington house itself, set near the tobacco rows gone to seed, never smoked at night and never smelled of supper, yet its steps were swept and its windows clean, and the twins were seen carrying water and bread with the practiced grace of dutiful adults rather than the ordinary clumsiness of 10-year-olds. They walked in synchrony, heads inclining at the same angle, hands folding with the same economy, and they regarded mourners with an attention that resembled care until it resembled appraisal. First strangenesses did not announce themselves as wonders. They collected as small, regular deviations from sense. Clocks that had survived the war and the fever stopped within minutes of each other when the children were near and resumed without winding after they left. Milk soured on the shelf in houses they visited, while pails in neighboring kitchens kept sweet. Photographs fogged inside frames, bleaching faces to pale ovals as if identity could not be fixed under their gaze. In the churchyard, rings of mushrooms rose in twin lines by fresh mounds, and candle flames in the sanctuary leaned toward the twins, as though pulled by a draught confined to their bodies. Dogs crossed the road rather than passed them. The horses at the hitching rail turned their heads away and chewed the bit until foam strung white at their mouths. The town's women seamstresses, midwives, keepers of small, stubborn orders began to place sachets and iron pins over door lintels, the old protections that persist when reason tires, while the men tested new theories each week and abandoned them as quickly. Some insisted the twins were providential, visible proof that mercy still touched the valley. Others treated their perfection as a mask for whatever the fever had failed to carry off. That argument never reached a decision because evidence arranged itself without debate. The pastor's journal continued to anticipate the bell, and the doctor's notes continued to describe endings that resembled compliance rather than struggle. The town's map shrank to the lanes the children favored and the pew where they sat. Third row center, hymnals open to the correct page before anyone called it. Their lips moved with the congregation but never arrived a fraction late, and their voices met in a narrow seam that no one could part by singing louder. In the last warm weeks, Black Hollow learned a new etiquette that placed distance between breath and omen. Doors closed with a courtesy that pretended coincidence. Curtains shifted just enough to mark a passage. People stepped aside without meeting the pale glance that measured more than politeness requires. By the time sumac reddened at the edges of the fields, the community understood its arrangement. The pastor held a ledger that wrote itself, the doctor kept a science that could not diagnose, and the twins moved through both like auditors performing a review. Nothing in the valley contradicted them, and every refusal to name the pattern added another quiet entry to the season's account. The first true break in Black Hollow's uneasy balance came in late September when the community gathered for the burial of Elias Turner, a farmer in his prime who had been seen working his fields just 2 days before his sudden collapse. He had returned from the harvest barn pale, muttered about feeling chilled despite the warmth of the afternoon, and was found lifeless by dawn. There were no wounds, no fevers, no sign of contagion, and yet his wife insisted that the twins had been seen standing at the fence line the evening before, their expressions calm and unreadable as Elias stacked the last of his corn. The funeral was hurried, as so many had been that year, but something shifted when Pastor Morel opened his journal to record the death. In the margin, already written in the same even hand that had appeared before, was Elias Turner's name, with the exact date of his passing, entered 3 days earlier than his final breath. The ink was dry, the strokes unalterable, and the handwriting matched none in the parish but the mysterious entries that had begun with the twins' arrival. Dr. Keene attempted to explain the death as cardiac failure, but his description failed to reassure. He had examined Elias weeks prior and found him healthy, with no history of ailments. Keene's notes grew hesitant, his medical reasoning undermined by the simplicity of the case. A strong man extinguished in a single night without struggle. In the tavern, whispers began to thread through the quiet air. Some recalled how the Turner's dog had howled at nothing the night before Elias died, clawing the doorframe until its paws bled. Others remembered that milk set out on the Turner porch had curdled overnight despite the cool air. Soon after, another loss followed. Widow Hensley, who had tended her garden with steady resolve through fever and drought, was found seated upright in her chair, eyes open but unseeing, hands folded as if in prayer. Neighbors swore that the twins had visited her doorstep the afternoon prior, carrying a basket of bread. They had left no words, only their synchronized boo before retreating, and by nightfall the widow's house was silent. Pastor Morel's journal again contained her name, before news had reached the parish. He tried to convince himself that his own tired hand had written it in some fugue of exhaustion, but the precision of the letters and their perfect alignment with the earlier mysterious entries left him shaken. The pattern deepened with small but telling details. Clocks in homes the twins entered stopped at the hour of their departure, resuming without winding once they had gone. Candles burned lower than their length would allow, dripping wax as if consumed by invisible breath. At Sunday service, the congregation felt the air grow dense when the twins sang, their hymn pitched not louder but more exact than the others, closing the space between sound and silence until voices faltered around them. Dr. Keene began charting what he called incidental fatalities, deaths that bore no connection in medicine but were united by timing and presence. Elias Turner, strong farmer. Widow Hensley, elderly but not ill. A visiting peddler, robust and healthy, collapsing at the edge of town after remarking on the unnerving stare of 2 children who watched from the road. Each time, Morel's journal reflected the loss before it was spoken aloud, as if the ledger itself obeyed the twins' knowledge. By October, the town's unease hardened into suspicion. Families closed shutters at the sound of the children's steps. Mothers clutched infants closer when the twins walked past. The pews around their usual place at church remained empty, leaving them isolated at the center like an altar no one dared to approach. And yet no one acted against them. The twins never showed malice, never raised a hand, never uttered a threat. They only appeared, observed, and departed, while those within their orbit ceased to live. The first incident thus was not a single death, but a sequence that pressed the town into fearful recognition. What began with Elias Turner's sudden silence unfolded into a pattern too precise to ignore, confirmed by the pastor's impossible records and the doctor's failing explanations. Black Hollow crossed from rumor into dread, and the children at its center became less like orphans of tragedy and more like heralds of something older, measuring lives as if they had always known the sum. By October, the atmosphere of Black Hollow had changed beyond recognition. What had once been a village limping forward through grief now resembled a settlement under siege from within, bound by invisible rules no one dared to break. The deaths that followed Elias Turner and Widow Hensley did not arrive as accidents or illnesses, but as a sequence that unfolded with mechanical precision, each new loss tightening the noose of suspicion. The pastor's journal reflected the events before they happened, each name written in the same small hand with dates that proved exact when the bells tolled. The townspeople moved through their days as though rehearsing a script they had not agreed to, pausing only to glance over their shoulders toward the Harrington twins, who seemed always to be present, silent and unchanging. The first frost brought another burial. Caleb Green, a mill worker in his 30s, was found collapsed against the sluice gate before dawn, the water barely ankle-deep, yet enough to still his breath. Dr. Keene performed an examination and recorded no sign of drowning, no ruptured vessel, no trace of poison. The heart had simply ceased. That evening, Pastor Morrell opened his journal to discover Caleb's name already inscribed, followed by 2 small dashes, entered in ink that had dried days earlier. The discovery confirmed what the pastor had resisted admitting aloud. The record was not his own, and the deaths were anticipated with absolute certainty. The townspeople began to draw patterns from small occurrences that might once have been ignored. Milk spoiled more quickly in houses where the twins lingered, photographs clouded in their presence, and clocks across the settlement stopped in unison before resuming as if nothing had passed. Families took to barring their doors at dusk, placing sprigs of herbs in their windows and whispering prayers at thresholds. No one spoke directly of the children, yet the avoidance of their gaze became universal, a silent pact carried out in every lane and field. The tavern ceased to echo with laughter and instead became a chamber of muttered theories, half-formed explanations, and anxious silences when the door creaked open. Attempts to resist the pattern failed. 3 families prepared wagons to leave under cover of darkness, carrying provisions and tools in the hope of finding safety beyond the valley. Before they reached the ridge road, 1 wagon snapped an axle, another horse collapsed without cause, and a 3rd family returned when the eldest child fell ill with sudden paralysis. By dawn, the wagons stood abandoned, their owners silent, unwilling to explain why they had tried to escape. That evening, the pastor's journal bore 3 identical entries, turned back, each followed by 2 dashes, as though even acts of defiance were counted in the same ledger. Animals reflected the fear more openly than their masters. Dogs refused to follow the twins, howling from a distance but never approaching. Horses grew restless when they drew near, eyes rolling white, hooves striking the earth until foam gathered at their mouths. Birds abandoned the trees where the children passed, leaving branches stark against the sky. Even the crops seemed to wither more quickly on fields bordering the Harrington property, as though the soil itself registered their presence. The escalation became undeniable when the town's most stalwart figures faltered. The tavern keeper collapsed while serving a handful of men, his tray clattering to the floor as the twins walked past the door. Martha Hensley's nephew, who had returned to help with her farm, was found lifeless in the hayloft, within a day of greeting the children at the gate. Each name appeared in the journal, each death marked in advance. Even the doctor's casebooks, once filled with notes of pulse rates and tinctures, grew thinner as he recorded only the absence of cause, pages repeating the same conclusion, no explanation. By the harvest's end, Black Hollow had become a place where breath itself felt rationed. Neighbors no longer called to one another across fields, windows remained shuttered, and the road through town lay empty except for the twins walking hand in hand, their steps matched, their expressions serene. They entered homes with baskets of bread or water jugs, offerings of courtesy that left behind silence and dread. Every appearance was noted, every visit followed by the toll of the bell. Survivors began to measure their lives by proximity, each day praying the twins would choose another doorstep. Pastor Morel continued his sermons, though fewer attended each week. His words spoke of faith and trial, yet his own eyes betrayed the terror of a man whose book wrote itself. At night he dreamed of graves opening in neat rows, each marked with the twin dashes he had come to dread. Dr. Keene persisted in his examinations, but his instruments yielded only absence, leaving him to stare at lifeless bodies with a despair that gnawed at his reason. The town itself seemed suspended between endurance and collapse, caught in the rhythm of deaths that no prayer or medicine could halt. As autumn deepened, the pattern no longer resembled chance or plague, but order, deliberate and inescapable. The Harrington twins, untouched and immaculate, moved among the ruins of Black Hollow as though they were not children at all, but keepers of an ancient count. Each burial confirmed their presence. Each entry in the journal strengthened the sense that survival was no longer governed by nature or providence, but by the inscrutable arithmetic carried in their watchful silence. By November, the rhythm of loss in Black Hollow had hardened into a schedule that no one admitted aloud, but everyone obeyed. The ledger in the parsonage continued to fill itself, entries appearing between Pastor Morel's lines with a steadiness that matched the bell, each name joined to a date and a spare notation that never erred. What had been treated as rumor began to take on the weight of evidence. Farmers turning the last soil before frost found paired impressions in the creek mud where no one had crossed, small bare feet set side by side, with heels sunk as if under a weight that exceeded a child's frame. In the churchyard, twin rows of mushrooms mapped out the boundaries of new graves before spades touched earth. Photographs left on mantelpieces bloomed into pale ovals at the faces of those later inscribed in the journal, the emulsion lifting from the glass as if naming were a solvent. Dr. Keene, who had clung to natural causes longer than any other man in the valley, began to assemble a record that refused to behave like medicine. He measured body temperatures that fell below what his thermometers could credibly attest, and then rose again when the twins stepped away from a threshold. He timed pulses that halted not in decline but at exact minutes recorded hours earlier in the Parish book. He marked the positions of hands on clocks at 3 separate homes and found them all stalled within the same minute, then discovered that the hour matched a dry ink notation already waiting on Morel's page. He cut, weighed, and recorded, but every organ presented as sound, every vessel intact, every brain unclouded, as if the bodies had agreed to an instruction not delivered by blood or breath. The doctor's casebook turned from treatment to observation. The last pages read like field notes from a country no one else could see. Household diaries corroborated the drift toward certainty. In a tobacco ledger repurposed as a daybook, a widower recorded the precise moment 2 children stood outside his fence and the time his sister's hands went cold while pouring broth. In a school copybook rescued from the shuttered classroom, neat lessons in arithmetic gave way to columns of names kept by a girl who had learned orderly habits before the fevers, each line later matched to a burial. In Martha Hensley's kitchen, frost crept across glass in mirrored strokes that formed the same 2 dashes Morel dreaded in his margins. None of these witnesses spoke in public. They wrote because the act of writing preserved a small power over sequence, and even that comfort was shrinking. Material traces accumulated where explanations fell away. Soot above lamp chimneys tilted toward places the twins had stood, a lean that persisted when lamps were moved. Bread left under clean cloth molded in a pairing pattern, 2 crescent blooms side by side, while loaves in neighboring houses kept. Nails driven to hang winter tools bent toward the Harrington lane, their iron pulled by a bias no magnet in town could answer. In the mill shed, flour settled in furrows like tide lines whenever Elias and Abigail passed. the ridges aligned with the grain of their joined steps. Dogs buried bones in two parallel trenches and refused to return to the spots once the twins had walked near. The evidence was small, local, stubborn. Taken together, it behaved like intention. The community attempted procedures that might have counted as experiments. The twins were kept at the parsonage for a day, with 3 witnesses present, their movements noted on paper at intervals, the windows nailed shut against accusation and draft. A laborer died in his field at the appointed hour nonetheless, and when the pastor opened the journal to confirm the entry, he found the inked line already drying across a page he had hidden beneath a locked board. A second trial placed the book itself on the altar with 2 elders posted to watch and a chalk slate set beside it for any intrusion to mark. By morning, the journal lay closed but warm. The slate was blank, and a death had occurred on the far edge of the valley, exactly when a thin line of scorch appeared in the oak rail where parishioners knelt. The men who had kept vigil found their names added later under a heading not of deaths, but of witnesses, as if the ledger had widened its appetite to include those who believed themselves neutral. As winter approached, the town's few ordinary measures of confidence surrendered. The tavern ledger stopped tracking credit and began recording hours when the twins were seen on the road. Entries ceased to list debts and instead listed distances from sightings. The blacksmith's tally of repairs gave way to measurements of how long iron cooled when the children walked past the forge, a loss of heat that defied the logic of coal and draft. The postmaster, who had once counted letters and schedules, inventoried the silence of the ridge road by marking how many days in a row no wheel tracks crossed the first snow. Lists replaced stories, numbers replaced consolation. The arithmetic felt imposed. For the first time, bones entered the account. A stray dog unearthed a shallow pit near the old river path where a family had camped during the sickness. What the men found when they followed the animal's frantic scraping were not the remains of the recently dead, but ossified fragments older than the epidemic and arranged in a manner that suggested placement rather than accident. 2 arm bones laid parallel, 2 small ribs set lengthwise atop them, and a scatter of pebbles that, when brushed aside, revealed a pair of short cuts in the clay like dashes. There was no conclusion to draw that softened what they saw. The sight was reburied without a word, but the discovery traveled in gestures and averted eyes. When the river fell after a cold snap, a second arrangement appeared near a bend where children used to wade. Shells stacked in 2 tidy columns no current would make, and, beneath them, a coin worn smooth bearing a year older than any living memory in Black Hollow. The coin's face had been abraded until it showed no person at all, only a blank that reflected whoever looked. Dr. Keene's skepticism failed in stages that he recorded with the painful clarity of a man dismantling his own conviction. He charted barometric pressure and found dips that coincided with the twins' hymns, not with weather. He weighed the pastor's journal on a scale borrowed from the dry goods store and documented slight increases on mornings after new names appeared, as if each entry carried mass. He hung a pendulum from the schoolhouse beam and watched it settle toward the Harrington lane when the children walked by, then drift back after they vanished from sight. None of this proved cause. All of it proved order. In the final pages of his notes, that autumn, he admitted in careful script that he had failed to isolate a mechanism, and that the absence of mechanism did not release him from the evidence. He began to write less like a physician and more like a surveyor, charting a boundary laid down before his profession existed. The town's oldest men and women, who had outlived 2 wars and 1 plague, reached for explanations that placed the twins' inside stories older than rail timetables and schoolbooks. They spoke not to each other but to their kitchens and sheds, addressing gaps where their dead had been. The valley felt older than its buildings. The oaks along the ridge shed bark in long paired strips. Foxfire glowed on fallen logs in twin bars. Frost on windows ruled itself into parallel lines, even when heated from within. The pattern extended beyond human breath until the people understood that they were not merely being haunted by children, but indexed by a principle that used the shape of children to show itself. It became possible to imagine that the epidemic had not spared the Harrington twins so much as revealed them, that they belonged to a count begun long before Black Hollow was named. By the first hard freeze, even resistance reorganized itself into ritual. Households left bowls of water by doors to mark the hour. A film of ice would skin over after the twins passed, then scratched that hour into table legs to prove they had seen it. Windowsills gathered small offerings arranged in twos, not as bargains but as acknowledgments. The church pews around the third row remained empty by custom rather than fear, a buffer maintained like a boundary line. No one believed these gestures turned the pattern aside. They were acts of witness in a place where witnessing had become the only competency left. The escalation's final proof did not arrive as spectacle, but as a document that no one could refute. In late November, a ledger from the mill, an ordinary account book that had been kept for years, was found to contain, between pages of flour weights and hours worked, a quire of sheets cut from a different stock. The paper was thinner, the ruling finer, the ink older. On those sheets, names appeared from decades past, some of people the oldest townsfolk dimly recalled, some of settlers who had left no trace. Each line followed the same format as the pastor's journal and ended with the twin dashes. The dates predated the church itself. The hand was the same even script that now visited Morell's margins. Two ledgers kept in different houses by different men for different purposes told the same tally across time. Whatever counted, Black Hollow had not begun with the epidemic. It had only grown visible to those still living. What remained by the turn into winter was a settlement that had exhausted language for mercy and settled into observation. The twins continued their quiet circuit, immaculate and punctual, their presence measurable in clocks, weights, and lines of frost. The doctor recorded, the pastor recorded, the valley recorded in mushrooms, soot, and iron. The rumor had dissolved into a field of facts, and the facts arranged themselves into a shape that looked like intention older than memory, older than maps, older perhaps than churches with bells to answer it. If the silence of Black Hollow has already unsettled you, remember this is only the midpoint of our descent. The deaths, the journal, the children who never aged, all of it is just the surface of something far older and darker than the town itself. If you can feel a chill rising even now, it means you understand the weight of what comes next. Support this journey into America's forgotten terrors. Subscribe, ring the bell, and share this story with someone who dares to face such shadows. And tell us, what state are you listening from tonight? Perhaps the next forgotten horror waits closer to your own home than you think. By December, the silence of Black Hollow had thickened into something closer to paralysis. The frost came early, hardening the earth and sealing the graves beneath a crust of ice. Yet still the church bell tolled at intervals that no one questioned. The Harrington twins remained at the heart of every gathering and every loss, their presence immutable, their footsteps synchronized across snow that never seemed to take their weight. The escalation of autumn had prepared the ground for a final revelation, and it came not through rumor or whispered suspicion, but through an event too public to deny. The town had planned its winter service, the last great gathering before the heavy snows made travel difficult. Survivors who had avoided the pews for weeks forced themselves to return, driven by habit as much as by fear. The church filled with the smell of wool damp from melted frost. Lanterns hissed in the corners, and Pastor Morrell took his place at the pulpit with a face that betrayed his exhaustion. At the third row, Elias and Abigail sat, as always, hymnals open to the correct page, their voices rising not above, but perfectly within the congregation's sound. The service never ended. Halfway through the second hymn, a sound unlike any the church had heard before swept through the building. It was not a cry nor a cough, but a single collapse of breath as 6 members of the congregation fell at once. The blacksmith's widow, a pair of farmers, the tavern keeper's eldest son, and 2 girls barely past childhood, all folded silently where they stood. Panic scattered the hymn, benches scraped, and the lantern flames bent violently toward the center pew. At the axis of the confusion, the twins remained unmoved, their eyes reflecting the lantern light as if it were daybreak. Dr. Keene rushed from body to body, searching for pulse, listening for breath, but each had ceased as suddenly as if extinguished by command. He recorded later that none bore the marks of seizure or struggle. Only the blank stillness of lives cut short in unison. Pastor Morrell, trembling, opened his journal with dread certainty. The page already contained 6 names, entered in that familiar small hand, each marked with the date and the precise hour. The ink was dry, as though written days before. The service ended not with benediction, but with screams that carried into the frozen streets. Families fled, doors slammed, shutters barred, and the church stood empty save for the pastor, the doctor, and the twins, who walked calmly down the aisle and vanished into the night. By morning, Black Hollow had ceased pretending. The ledger dictated life and death, and the twins were no longer seen as survivors of tragedy, but as its arbiters. The climax deepened when an attempt was made to confront them directly. A group of men, led by Harlan Pike, who had lost his wife weeks earlier, gathered with lanterns and shovels to search the Harrington house. They found the dwelling immaculate but barren. No ashes in the hearth, no food in the larder, no bedding warm from use. The rooms were orderly to the point of vacancy, as though the house had been preserved for inspection rather than for living. What drew their attention most was the cellar, a narrow chamber dug deep beneath the foundation. There they discovered rows of markings etched into the stone with obsessive precision, columns of names, dates, and twin dashes repeating endlessly down the walls. Many names belonged to the town's dead, some stretched back to generations long past, and others bore dates not yet reached. At the far end of the cellar, a section remained empty, awaiting more. The discovery spread through the valley faster than any rumor. No longer could the deaths be dismissed as plague or coincidence. The records carved into stone mirrored the journal entries and confirmed that the children, or the force they embodied, had been counting long before the epidemic. Families who had once avoided speaking of them now whispered openly of something ancient inhabiting the forms of 2 10-year-olds. Dr. Keene attempted to study the cellar records by lantern light, transcribing as much as he could before the men filled the chamber with earth in a desperate attempt to bury what they had seen. His notes revealed not only the names of the dead, but the names of people still alive in Black Hollow, each with a date assigned in the near future. His own name was among them. So was the pastor's. So were nearly all who had gathered to confront the twins. The precision of the carvings left no space for chance. That night the town became a place of restless movement. Some tried to flee, loading wagons with what little they had, but their attempts ended as before with broken wheels, collapsed horses, and sudden illness that forced them back. Others locked themselves inside and prayed through the hours, only to hear the bell toll without warning and learn of another family stilled in silence. The pastor kept to his church, opening the journal each evening and finding new entries no hand had made. The doctor abandoned his instruments and began keeping watch over the streets, but the twins were never caught entering or leaving. They were simply present where the deaths occurred. The climax reached its sharpest point when fire broke out in the tavern. Flames rose against the snow, and the town rallied to fight the blaze with buckets of water drawn from the frozen well. As the roof caved, bodies were pulled from the smoke. 3 men overcome not by fire, but by sudden stillness, their faces untouched by burns, their limbs unmarked by struggle. The blaze was contained, but the deaths bore the same signature. That evening the pastor found their names in the journal, already recorded with the words "taken in fire." Fear hardened into certainty. Black Hollow was not merely cursed by children who had survived where others had fallen. It was governed by a force that counted, recorded, and culled with a system older than memory. The cellar walls had shown the truth, and the journal confirmed it. Survival was not determined by health, strength, or prayer, but by a ledger whose authorship remained unseen, carried in the pale eyes of Elias and Abigail. By the year's end, the graveyard swelled, the church stood nearly empty, and the streets echoed with the sound of doors barred against the cold. The twins continued their measured walk, unchanged, untouched by frost or fear, their steps aligned with a rhythm that no living soul could alter. What began as whispers about survivors had culminated in the realization that Black Hollow's fate was written not in heaven, not in earth, but in the silent arithmetic of 2 children who were never children at all. Snow closed the roads and sealed Black Hollow in a white silence that magnified every small sound, the creak of a hinge, the drag of a shovel, the far toll of a bell. No one pulled. After the cellar in the Harrington house was buried, the town tried to return to ritual without belief. The attempt ended when the church floor yielded its own testimony. During a thaw that loosened nails and warped boards, the choir loft sagged and a plank split to reveal a resin-sealed coffer set between joists older than the congregation. Inside lay a stack of ledgers bound in mismatched leather, their paper cut from different stocks and their inks ranging from fresh black to the brown of decades. The first pages predated the epidemic. Others reached back farther than the building, recording names from years when the valley had no steeple and only a field cross. Every line carried the same spare format the pastor had come to dread: a name, a date, and the twin mark that looked like dashes until repetition made it feel like notation. A few leaves were written in a neat school hand, others in clerkly script, a handful in the crabbed strokes of age. Across changes in hand, spelling, and ink, the cadence did not change. Dr. Keene treated the ledgers as a laboratory. He sorted by season, graphed the clustering of deaths, and compared them with weather logs kept by the miller. He established that entries surged with epidemics, and also in years when no disease swept through at all. He weighed individual volumes each morning and found imperceptible gains after new names appeared, a variation too slight for ordinary scales but consistent on the grocer's balance when measured with coin stacks. He placed a photographic plate inside the coffer overnight and found a fogged stripe shaped like the twin mark by dawn, though no light had entered the box. He set a pendulum under the choir beam and marked its swing on soot-blackened card. When the twins were present in the nave below, the ark settled toward their pew and returned to center after they left. He strung horsehair across thresholds to detect passage and scattered sifted flour across the chancel to trace prints. The morning brought clean floor and new entries without tracks, as if the act of writing did not require approach. The pastor pursued his own confirmations with a desperation that read like discipline. He copied the fresh lines to a separate book to prove the words were not in his mind. The copies remained cold while the original felt faintly warm at the margins. He left the journal closed with a mark folded deep between pages, then found the ribbon displaced and the page turned exactly to the next name. He set the book on the altar with 3 elders as witnesses and a slate beside it for any unaccounted hand to leave a sign. The slate remained blank while the rail where parishioners clenched their fingers acquired a narrow heat-scored line, the letters appearing there instead, as if the building would carry the writing if paper were denied. He burned one loose sheet to ash, and the words reconstituted the next day in the same hand on a fresh leaf drawn from the back. Further records surfaced in places no one had thought to search. A school copybook in a desk drawer held arithmetic problems, interrupted by columns of names from 2 summers past, the child's loops precise, the twin mark drawn with an almost decorative care. The dry goods ledger, when lifted from its drawer, sloughed a hidden quire cut from finer paper, its dates marking a season when the former pastor died and the town had no shepherd to keep the parish book. The mill's account of bags weighed and hours worked contained inserted leaves listing burials during a flood year before the churchyard fence existed. Across the artifacts the pattern was continuous, as if the town had been persuaded to preserve the count whether it knew it or not. The twins continued their circuit, and the bodies continued to exhibit the same refusal to explain themselves. The doctor recorded a collapse at the tavern bar with lungs unburned in a building that had caught briefly from a hearth spark, a drowning at the sluice gate with lungs dry and mud unstirred, a quiet stillness at a kitchen table with soup unspilled and a spoon resting as if paused. He noted pupils that did not narrow to lamplight, skin with no mottling, tongues unbitten, fists unclenched, hearts that ceased not in decline but at minutes foretold in ink. He marked the concordance of clocks that stopped at the same time, in 3 houses a lane apart, and began again 12 minutes later when, according to the ledger, the count resumed. He built calendars that stacked upon one another like plates, days aligning where the twins had been seen, and hours aligning where their hymn coincided with wind slant and temperature fall. He began to write less in sentences and more in measures. A last communal effort gathered under the winter sky. The town isolated the twins in the schoolhouse from sunrise to sunset, with 6 watchers and a sealed door, the windows boarded and the stove cold. They recorded every minute and spoke their records aloud, through the timber cracks to be echoed back by witnesses outside. At midday, across the valley, a pair of farmhands stopped moving while lifting sacks in the mill and lay side by side on the plank floor. The entry already waited in the pastor's journal with the hour matched to the watcher's paper. The men who had volunteered to prove a natural cause found their names penciled under a new heading in the margin of the parish book that had never been used before, a category that read like witness rather than victim. The pressure of evidence forced the community to change the question. It no longer asked how to stop the writing. It asked how it ended a season. The ledgers gave one answer in their own arithmetic. Each volume closed with a short concluding sheet where no names appeared, only a date and the twin mark drawn longer and deeper as if scored. The date shifted within a narrow band that clustered around the longest night. The pastor read this as a terminus given in advance. The doctor read it as a pattern that had completed itself for previous years. When the solstice came, the town prepared for it as if for a storm that had already begun. People placed buckets near doors to hear the first skin of ice form after footsteps passed and to measure the hour of formation against the count. The church was lit from afternoon onward. Lanterns hung along the nave until the air tasted of tin and smoke. The journal lay closed on the altar with an iron weight on its cover, and a length of chain wound through the ring. The pew around the 3rd row remained empty, an absence that felt like a line drawn on a map. Close to midnight the bells sounded without rope. The stove's iron popped like a knuckle. The lantern flames leaned toward the aisle and held there in a steady slant. What followed left marks the town could describe, but not parse. A pressure moved through the nave that did not come from wind. Frost crept inward across the glass in 2 parallel bands and stopped at the lead seams. The pendulum under the choir beam eased its motion until it hung in place, an impossibility that lasted for breaths counted aloud by 3 men who could not agree later on the number. The chain across the journal did not shift, yet when the pastor lifted the iron and opened the cover, the last page had been turned, and the final line written in the same careful hand that had crossed every month. The conclusion occupied a single stretched band of ink. The twin mark extended until it reached the page edge and bled into the paper, the date below it this night. The twins were in the church without anyone seeing them enter. They were seen in the 3rd pew, then seen again near the chancel rail, then seen by someone else in the aisle, as if position meant less than appearance. They stood without breath fog and without snowmelt darkening their shoes. Their faces did not alter. Their eyes reflected the lantern wicks. When the bells struck the hour, the lanterns fluttered but did not go out, and the room emptied of sound except the small creak of timber that always follows great cold. The next moment had no witnesses willing to swear to sequence. Some said the pew held only the impression of weight upon its varnish, 2 shallow hollows side by side where no bodies sat. Others said they saw the children step toward the altar and fade, not as smoke fades but as print fades when rubbed. A few stated that the door opened, their backs felt a draft, and the snow outside held 2 lines of bare footprints that ran straight as rule to the gate and ended in unbroken white. By morning the roads were quiet, the ledgers were still, and the journal remained open to its last page, with no new names penned beneath the final mark. The doctor sat with his instruments unused and wrote that the pressure in his ears had relented, and the taste of metal had left his tongue. The pastor closed the book and found its weight unchanged for the first day in months. The town waited through hours that failed to deliver another tolling. At dusk, a few men walked the lanes and found nothing disturbed. No ash in hearths at the Harrington house, no thread caught in splinters at the schoolhouse door. In the church, 2 faint lines glowed on the altar rail where the letter score had burned itself. The wood char uncrumbling under a fingernail, a mark that resisted sanding as if it held not heat, but decision. The disappearance of the twins did not announce itself as escape or abduction. It presented itself as the cessation of a function. The counting had finished for the year, and the counters were absent the way a hand is absent when a sum has been carried over to another column. Houses exhaled. Animals returned to their familiar circuits. The tavern ledger resumed listing debts and measures of grain. The school bell did not ring, but its silence no longer felt punitive. In the ledgers from the coffer, the final pages of earlier volumes gave the same pattern of ending, followed by long blank stretches until spring, when the first names of a new season began in the same unchanging hand. The implication was a calendar rather than a cure. Black Hollow stepped into this interval with relief and an understanding that did not grant safety. The removal of the figures that had borne the pattern did not remove the pattern. The entries would resume after winter if the books were trustworthy, and the town had already learned that the books were the most reliable instrument it possessed. What vanished that night were the bodies of the Harrington children and the last objection that events could be ascribed to fever or chance. What remained was evidence, bound and carved, and the recognition that a force older than sermons and medicine had used the forms of 2 perfect children to conduct a year's accounting. The aftermath of the Black Hollow revelations did not bring peace to the community. Instead, it left behind confusion, fear, and a silence heavier than the epidemic that had already claimed most of the town. In the weeks following the fire and the discovery of the journals, survivors tried to rebuild a sense of order. The churchyard filled again, not from sickness this time, but from burials hastily conducted for those whose deaths bore the strange connection to the twins. Families who had buried their loved ones under wooden markers now stood among scorched ruins, trying to understand why the children who had once seemed like heaven's gift now appeared to embody something ancient and merciless. Authorities from Richmond arrived, summoned by Pastor Morell's desperate letters and the reports carried by frightened travelers who passed through. The officials expected to find plague or violence, but what they encountered defied their frameworks. 2 children survive an epidemic, yet wherever they go, death follows, wrote a clerk in his official memorandum, and the accounts of their knowledge of future events appear in the pastor's hand with detail too precise to dismiss. The journals became the focus of heated arguments. Some dismissed them as the fevered writings of a man undone by grief. Others insisted that no imagination could predict deaths with such accuracy. The neat handwriting, the lists of names with dates that later aligned exactly with the tolling of the church bell, were too much for rational minds to explain. The townspeople who remained carried scars deeper than the visible fire damage. They whispered of how the twins stood among the ruins with expressions unmarked by loss, how they watched coffins lower into the soil without tears, and how their presence seemed to still the very air. Mothers drew their children away from them. Farmers crossed to the other side of the lane when the pair approached, yet no one dared speak openly against them. The memory of how quickly strong men had collapsed in their company lingered as a silent warning. To accuse them was to risk becoming the next entry in the ledger. By winter, Black Hollow was nearly deserted. Families who could afford to leave packed their wagons and sought new beginnings in other counties. Those too poor to depart huddled in their homes, living half-lives of suspicion and dread. The Harrington twins remained in the parsonage, cared for in a perfunctory way by neighbors who felt both fear and obligation. "They are not ours," one widow wrote in a letter preserved in her family papers, "but neither will they leave. It is as if the land itself binds them here." The authorities, after weeks of deliberation, withdrew without action. They had no legal ground on which to hold children who had committed no provable crime and no explanation they could present to courts or churches without appearing superstitious. The journals of Pastor Morell were archived in Richmond, sealed with the note that their contents were to be reviewed when the advancement of science allows proper understanding. Yet among the townsfolk, copies of certain passages were secretly kept, whispered from family to family. One entry in particular came to symbolize the fear that clung to the valley. "They are not children. They mark the living as the gravedigger marks earth. The dates arrive as sure as the seasons. When they smile, someone dies." Attempts to frame their existence in medical or natural terms were made by visiting physicians. They suggested mass hysteria, collective trauma after the epidemic, or poisoning that coincided with the children's presence. But such theories collapsed under the weight of the records. Too many events matched, too many deaths fell on the precise dates inscribed by an unerring hand. The explanation that remained unspoken but increasingly accepted was that the twins were vessels of something far older than the town itself. Whether curse, omen, or incarnation of a force beyond Scripture, none could say. The long-term consequences extended far beyond the Hollow. Black Hollow itself faded from maps by the end of the century, absorbed into surrounding counties, its name recalled only in local ghost tales. Travelers spoke of a cursed valley where farms never prospered and where children's laughter was never heard. A generation later, historians piecing together epidemic records found the odd anomaly, one family line ending abruptly, save for 2 children whose later fate was unrecorded. The omission was not accidental. Families who had fled the valley refused to speak of them. "Best forgotten" became the refrain, yet fragments endured. A schoolteacher in 1891 recorded that she had received a leather-bound book from her grandmother containing the Morell marks, names and dates long past, every one proven correct. The last page, however, bore 2 names without dates, Elias and Abigail. The absence suggested not survival, but continuation. If the deaths of others were measured, theirs remained unwritten, as though they stood outside the ledger of mortality. For survivors, the psychological toll was immense. Those who lived in proximity to the twins often developed nervous afflictions described in medical records of the 1880s as consumptive of the spirit. Nightmares of children standing silent at the foot of beds plagued many until their deaths. Families fractured under the weight of suspicion, with some insisting the twins should have been driven into the wilderness, and others terrified that any harm to them would unleash punishment worse than plague. This division eroded the fragile community until it ceased to function as a town at all. Theological explanations emerged in sermons across Virginia. Some ministers preached that the twins were proof of divine wrath, left behind as reminder of unrepented sin. Others argued they were evidence of predestination, vessels carrying God's inscrutable plan. But among parishioners, the fear outweighed doctrine. If they are God's will, one parish record noted, then His mercy has left us. In later years, as folklore studies developed, Black Hollow became a case cited as an example of living omens, figures whose presence shaped destiny rather than merely observed it. The last confirmed account of the twins places them leaving the hollow in the late 1880s, walking east along a disused road. A farmer's diary described two figures, still child-sized, though more than a decade had passed since their first mention, moving with perfect symmetry. Their eyes were like mirrors, he wrote, and they looked at me as if they had already written my end. The farmer died within the week. His entry remains the final tether of the Black Hollow twins to documented history. What remains, more than a century later, is not a complete story, but an enduring consequence. The unease of knowing that a community faced something beyond disease, violence, or reason. The epidemic had left graves, but the twins left questions without answers. Pastor Morell's closing words in his final journal capture the essence of that dread. We feared pestilence and hunger, yet what we received was older than both. They walk as children, but they reckon as time itself. And when they are gone, the silence they leave is not peace, but a waiting. Thus, Black Hollow ended not with rebuilding, but with erasure. Its fields grew wild, its homes decayed, its church collapsed into ruin. Yet the story of Elias and Abigail endured in whispers and footnotes, a reminder that some survivors carry marks more terrible than death. And for those who read the journals or hear the tale by firelight, the true consequence is the lingering thought that somewhere, in some other quiet valley, two children may still be walking, their ledger not yet complete. History leaves behind ruins, graves, and forgotten names, but in places like Black Hollow it also leaves questions that refuse to die. The Harrington twins were never captured, never confessed, never even truly accused in any official record, and yet the silence they left behind weighs heavier than the epidemic that once emptied the valley. Their story is not only about two children who survived where others perished, but about what they revealed, that mortality itself can be measured, that death may walk with a face too familiar to fear until it is too late. The ledgers, the journals, the carvings in cellar stone, each testified to a force older than scripture and colder than science, a reminder that life can be counted not by years, but by the unseen arithmetic of something beyond us. As you step away from this story, ask yourself what it means to live under the shadow of such certainty. Would you want to know the hour of your ending written in a hand you could not erase? Or is ignorance the only mercy left to us? Black Hollow teaches that survival is not always a gift, and that sometimes the most terrible fate is to remain and witness. If this tale of silence and inevitability has unsettled you, share it so others may confront the darkness buried in our past. subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us from what state you listen tonight, for the next forgotten account may not be buried in Virginia's soil, but closer to your own. And remember, the most haunting stories are not those of ghosts, but of the living who were never meant to be.